The distress signal from the Farali cluster had been active for 11 months. I had read it every morning for 11 months. The same way I read the weather projections for a station that had no weather. The same way I reviewed the schedule for meetings I had already attended in my dreams. The signal was 3 words in Farali standard, and the translation was always the same, and I had long since stopped letting it sit in my chest the way it had that first day. I am Ambassador Vreth Ka of the Soloon Collective. My people have 6 limbs, skin that changes color with emotion whether we want it to or not, and 34 years of diplomatic experience stretched across 17 ceasefires and 4 full peace settlements. I am very good at sitting across a table from someone who wants to burn the galaxy and convincing them to sign a document instead. This is the thing I believed, right up until the morning the ship arrived. The Grand Convocation Hall of the Interstellar Council was the greatest room in the known galaxy, and I say that not as flattery but as fact. 412 species had contributed to its construction. The ceiling was high enough that 3 species who photosynthesized kept their seedlings in the upper galleries. The floor was made of a composite material, chosen because it felt neutral underfoot to every species present, which meant it felt deeply uncomfortable to all of them, in exactly the same way, which the architects apparently felt was a reasonable starting point for diplomacy. I had been sitting in that hall for 6 hours. Across from me, the Daruk sovereignty delegation occupied their raised platform, the way a predator occupies the highest point of a hill, not because the high ground was tactically useful in a negotiating chamber, but because standing above everyone else was simply how they understood space. The Daruk were large. Their bilateral symmetry was the kind that evolution produces when it wants something to be very good at catching things that run. Their primary diplomat, a male called Vekrath Dune, had been speaking for 3 consecutive hours about the legal framework under which the Farali cluster now belonged to his people. He was not wrong about the legal framework. That was the terrible part. The Convocation Charter had 17 clauses about territorial acquisition, and the Daruk had threaded through all 17 of them with the patience of a species that had done this before and expected to do it again. 11 billion people in the Farali cluster. 3 weeks. No survivors with functioning memory. I had drafted the formal objection letter myself. I had used very strong language. It had been submitted in triplicate to the relevant subcommittees and was currently being reviewed by a panel that would report back within 90 days. 90 days. My aide, a young Soloon named Peth who had just completed his 3rd year in diplomatic service and still believed very firmly that the right document could stop anything, was sitting beside me with his stylus and his note tablet, and I could see from the pale gold shimmer running along his neck that he was frightened. He was hiding it well. I had taught him that. Hide the color. Keep your face still. Never let the other side know what your skin is doing. Mine was doing the amber of long and very tired endurance. I was not trying to hide it. Nobody was looking at me anyway. Everyone was looking at Vekrath Dunn, who had just produced a 17-point addendum to his previous argument, and was presenting it with the confidence of someone who had never once in their life needed to wonder whether they would win. Then every sensor in the convocation hall went red at once. Not orange, not the yellow of caution, or the slow amber of advisory alert. Red, the color that the shared alert system, designed by a committee of 12 species over 40 years of careful collaboration, used for exactly one category of event. Weapons lock. Something had arrived in our sector and every automated defense system on the station had identified it and reached the same conclusion in the same half-second, and that conclusion was red. Vekrath Dunn stopped mid-sentence. I had never seen a Daruk stop mid-sentence before. I had not believed they were physically capable of it. The main display above the chamber, 40 meters across, usually cycled through procedural documents and committee updates, flickered once, and resolved into the sensor feed from the station's outer arrays. 1 ship. I want you to understand what that means. The Daruk fleet that had taken the Farali cluster in 3 weeks had comprised 240 vessels. The convocation station itself was protected by a ring of 17 sentinel platforms, each one a deterrent and a promise. When species arrived to make statements, they arrived with numbers. Numbers were the language everyone spoke. 1 ship had arrived. It was not large by warship standards. It did not match any profile in the convocation's registry. Its hull configuration was unfamiliar. Its drive signature was unfamiliar. and the frequency on which it was broadcasting was one that the translation system flagged with a notation I had never seen before in 34 years. Humor detected. Confidence. Low. The chamber was completely silent. 412 species, their delegates and aides and technical staff and security personnel, and the only sound was the very soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant, faint, impossible-to-place smell of whatever the Thurvaki delegation always burned that nobody had ever successfully identified. Then the transmission opened. The voice was female, human female, I would later learn, though at that moment I had only the most theoretical understanding of what a human female sounded like. She spoke in Galactic Standard with an accent that put the emphasis in unexpected places, and she spoke the way someone speaks when they are not performing calm, but actually are calm, which is a different thing entirely, and most species never learn to tell the difference. She said her name was Captain Nina Caldwell, of the vessel IHS Reckoning. She said they had received our distress signal. She said she was sorry they were late, and that there had been a fueling stop, and a disagreement about classification of the operation. And she said that last part, with something in her voice that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Then she addressed the Daruk sovereignty directly. 6 hours, she said. Use them. That was all. The transmission closed. Vekrath Dun made a sound I had no translation for. Then he made a second sound that I did have a translation for, and it was not something I will repeat in any official record, but the meaning was clear enough. He was not frightened. He was offended. A single ship, one vessel with a female commander who apologized for being late, and then gave a deadline to a species that had never, in 400 years of recorded history, met one they respected. He laughed. I had attended 509 formal sessions in this chamber. I had heard many things. I had heard species threaten each other, flatter each other, lie to each other with such technical precision that the lies were more beautiful than most truths I had encountered. I had never heard a species laugh at a human. Peth leaned toward me. He was very young, and in that moment he looked younger still, and the gold of his fear had deepened to something closer to copper. He said, in our home tongue, very quietly, "Should we warn them?" He meant the Darak. I opened my mouth. I thought about the 412 files in the Convocation Archive labeled Human Military History, Context, Primitive Era. I thought about the Ferali distress signal. 3 words. 11 months. I thought about Vekrath Dun, still laughing, his delegation joining in now, a low, rumbling cascade of Darak amusement filling the chamber, while one ship sat in our outer sensor range and did nothing at all. I closed my mouth. I had read every historical account of human warfare ever submitted to the Convocation Archives, all 412 of them. I had filed them under that label, Context, Primitive Era, and moved forward, because that is what a diplomat does. You contextualize, you categorize, you file things where they will not distress you unnecessarily. I was no longer certain that had been the correct filing decision. The laughter was still going when the Reckoning's engines began to warm. They appeared on the sensor display as a deepening signature in the drive array, a quiet and technical thing that the Darak delegation almost certainly did not know how to read, because why would they? The Darak did not read sensor data for other species' ships. The Darak did not need to. Except that someone on my staff had cross-referenced the drive signature against a database I had not known we had. A small and very old file that some predecessor of mine had apparently requested from a human trade contact 40 years ago, and which had been sitting in our archive ever since. And the notation that came back was 2 words. Combat ready. The Darak sent their response 40 minutes later. It was creative. It was comprehensive. It suggested that Captain Caldwell might consider a number of alternative activities in lieu of whatever she was planning, and it did so in terms that the translation system flagged 4 separate times for content. The Reckoning did not respond. Its engines continued warming. Peth looked at me. His stylus was very still in his hand. I looked at the single ship on the sensor display. It was not moving. It was not posturing. It was simply there, in the way that a closed door is simply there, except that some closed doors, if you have read the right files, you know better than to open. I started drafting a mediation request. It was what I knew how to do. It was the only thing I knew how to do. My skin, which I had spent 34 years learning to control in public, was doing something I had no diplomatic name for. Not fear, not grief, not the amber of endurance. Something older than all of those. Something that felt, if I am being precise, like the moment before a very large and very quiet thing stands up. The 6 hours began like every diplomatic crisis I had ever managed. Frantic, loud, full of people talking very quickly and very confidently about things they did not fully understand, including me. My first action was to open a formal channel to the human vessel. This was protocol. When an unannounced military presence enters a convocation-adjacent zone, the senior diplomatic representative of the host body makes contact within 15 minutes and establishes terms of communication. I had done this 41 times in my career, twice with species that were actively threatening the station, once with a Thervaki battle group that turned out to have taken a wrong turn at a navigational beacon, which is a sentence I still find difficult to believe I ever wrote in an official report. I composed the message carefully. It acknowledged the reckoning's presence. It expressed the convocation's appreciation for the concern shown toward the Ferali situation. It very gently and very professionally suggested that unilateral military positioning, without prior consultation, created certain procedural complications that we would very much appreciate discussing. I sent it. Then I waited. My aide Peth was updating the incident log. Around us, the smaller rooms branching off the main convocation corridor were filling with noise as every delegation ran their own internal response. I could hear 6 different languages through 6 different walls, all of them cycling through what sounded like the same conversation in different vocabularies. What do we do? What do we do? What do they want? What do we do? Hour 1 passed. No response from the reckoning. The Daruk delegation, meanwhile, had issued a formal statement of their own. I read it on my tablet, while Peth brought me a cup of something warm that was intended to approximate tea and fell somewhat short of that ambition. The statement was long and confident, and it used the word sovereignty 17 times. It noted that the human vessel's presence constituted a violation of Daruk territorial claim space, as the surrounding sector had been formally incorporated into the sovereignty under Convocation Charter Article 12, subsection 4. It demanded the vessel withdraw within 2 hours, or face appropriate response. I read the part about appropriate response twice. Then I read the reckoning's engine status on the passive sensor display that Peth had quietly set up on the corner of my desk. The engines were still warming. There is a specific kind of quiet that a ship has when it is not yet doing anything but has decided everything. I did not know that then. I learned it later, much later, from a human technical manual that a colleague sent me after all of this was over, during the period when I was trying to understand everything I had not understood. The manual called it pre-engagement configuration. The convocation's own military theorists, the few we had, called it something longer and less honest. I called it, at the time, the thing that was making my skin do things no diplomatic briefing had ever prepared it to do. Hour 2. The convocation secretary prime herself called me. Her name was Gore Valen, a Thervaki elder, 700 years old by her species reckoning, which in Saloon terms was approximately the same as describing someone as the mountains. She had governed this body through 3 major conflicts, one near-extinction event, and the famous Yelvani currency collapse of 2209, which technically was not a military crisis but which I can confirm from personal experience was far more emotionally damaging than several of the military ones. She called me because I was the senior diplomat on duty. She called me because the reckoning had not responded to anyone, not to my message, not to the 3 formal communications the council secretariat had sent, not to the Daruk ultimatum, not to the personal transmission that the Velhari delegate, Councillor Orath Pell, had sent through back channels that I had not officially acknowledged. Not to anyone. She asked me what I thought we should do. I told her I was working on 3 simultaneous response frameworks. She asked me which one I thought would work. I was quiet for a moment. 34 years of training said, present the most viable option with measured confidence. Project competence. Your uncertainty is not the council's problem. Your uncertainty is your own, to manage in private. I said, I am not certain any of them will work, Secretary Prime. Another first. She looked at me through the comm screen for a long time, her chromatic patches, which Thervaki use the way we Soloon use our skin, had gone the gray-green of a Thervaki who is choosing very carefully what they say next. She said, "Keep working." The channel closed. I kept working. Hour 3. Peth had moved the sensor display to the center of my desk by now, without my asking him to. He had also, without my asking, pulled up everything in our archive on human military operations. It was a lot. The file labeled Context, Primitive Era, was, I now understood, very long. The Darak attaché contacted me privately, at hour 3 and 14 minutes. He was a male named Sorath Vel, older than Vekrith Dunn, with fewer teeth, and considerably more experience. We had sat across from each other for 17 months. I had developed, in that time, a very particular kind of relationship with him that diplomats sometimes develop with their counterparts, which is not friendship, and is not trust, but is a kind of professional recognition. He knew how I worked. I knew how he worked. We had, in the way of people who have spent months carefully not saying what they meant, learned to understand each other somewhat. He asked me, without preamble, whether the human action was theater. I told him I did not know. There was a pause on his end of the line. He said, "You have read their history files." I said, "Yes." He said, "And?" I did not answer immediately. I looked at the sensor display. The reckoning had moved. Just slightly. A small positional adjustment, the kind that looked almost like drift until you ran the numbers, until you let the tactical analysis software pull up the geometry of it, and show you what the new position meant relative to the Darak flagship's location in the outer approach corridor. I said, "I recommend you take the 6 hours seriously." Sorath Vel was quiet. Then he said something in Darak that the translator rendered as, "We have never taken a deadline seriously from a single ship." I said, "I know." He closed the channel. Hour 4. The Thervaki general found me in the corridor outside my office. His name was Var Sol. He was old even by Thervaki reckoning, which is a significant statement, and he had a scar that ran from his upper left chromo patch all the way down to his collar, which I knew from context meant he had taken a wound in combat and had chosen not to have it fully repaired, which among the Thervaki is a communication and not vanity. He was not part of my current situation in any official capacity. He was attached to the Thervaki Security Observer Delegation, which was a polite name for what Thervaki called their military watchers. He had been on the station for 8 months. We had spoken 4 times. He stopped me in the corridor and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly, without any particular drama, "Ambassador, I have fought in 4 wars. I have been on the losing side of 2 of them. I have surrendered twice, and I have watched other species decide not to fire on retreating forces when they could have, and I have watched species decide otherwise." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know what it looks like when a species is deciding. They move differently. They speak less. They position their forces in ways that only make sense if they have already made a choice, and are simply waiting for the clock to run out." I looked at the general for a long time. He said, "The humans have not been deciding since they arrived. They decided before they came. The ship did not come here to choose. It came here already having chosen." I said, "What do you recommend?" He said, "I am a general, ambassador. Recommendation is your role. I am simply informing you of what I see." He walked away. I stood in the corridor. The ventilation hum was very loud in my head. Hour 5. The Darak delegation went silent. Not formally silent, not a declared communication blackout, but practically silent, which was different and worse. Vekrath Dunn, who had been speaking for 9 of the past 14 hours, stopped speaking. The Darak secondary communications channel, which had been pulsing with regular traffic since the Reckoning's arrival, went to minimal signal. Their delegation's reading of our shared sensor feeds spiked, meaning they were watching the same display I was watching, every minute, the way you watch something when you can no longer afford not to. My skin had gone the pale amber of saloon grief, and I had stopped trying to manage it an hour earlier. There was nobody to perform composure for. Peth had seen me in worse states, and the corridor was empty, and sometimes the body simply knows before the mind decides to accept it, and the skin says what the mouth is not ready to say. Sorath Vel contacted me again, at hour 5 and 40 minutes. He said, "Is there anything the convocation can offer, as an intermediary framework, that might—" I said, "Sorath, He stopped. I had never used his given name before. In 17 months. Not once. I said, "There is no framework for this moment. This moment is not that kind of moment." There was a long pause. He said, "I see." Then, "Tell me something honestly, Ambassador." I said, "If I can." He said, "In your professional judgment, what will happen when the 6 hours end?" I looked at my desk, at the sensor display, at the Reckoning's drive signature, which had moved, in the past hour, from the yellow band that indicated warming to the narrow red band at the far edge of the scale, the one my software labeled in small neutral letters. "Ready," I said. "I think you should get your people to a secure area of your ship." He was quiet for a very long time. Then the channel closed. Hour 6. Peth had set a timer. I do not know why he did it. He did not explain it, and I did not ask him. Maybe he needed the structure of it. Maybe he needed to know that even in moments when everything is outside any system you know how to use, time itself is still behaving normally. The timer was on his tablet, displayed in large numerals in Galactic Standard format, and it sat at the edge of my desk, and I watched it the way you watch a thing, when you already know what it means but some part of you is still hoping the numbers are wrong. The chamber was very quiet. At 57 seconds remaining, I filed my mediation request. It was a 14-page document. I had been writing it, in fragments, across the entire 6 hours, because it was the thing I knew how to do, and doing the thing you know how to do is sometimes the only way to stay inside your own skin when everything outside it is coming apart. It cited Convocation Charter Articles 7 through 11. It proposed a joint convocation human Darek review body with authority to recommend territorial remediation for the Farali cluster within 180 days. I sent it to the Reckoning's communication channel. The timer reached 0. The Reckoning fired. What I can tell you about the next 9 minutes I will tell you in the order I experienced it, because that is the only order I have. First, the sound. Not the weapon sound, which was happening outside the station and was arriving through sensors as data rather than noise. The sound inside the chamber. Every delegate present stopped what they were doing in the same half-second. Chairs that had been moving stopped. Voices that had been speaking stopped. The particular way that a room changes when the thing everyone has been discussing as a possibility becomes the thing everyone is watching happen. Second, the sensor display. I am not a military analyst, and I will not pretend to render accurate tactical description. What I saw was light and movement and numbers changing very quickly. What I understood from it, later, with help, was that the Reckoning engaged the Darek flagship at a distance that meant the Darek point defense systems had almost no useful response window. What I understood was that the Reckoning did not move in straight lines, and that the Darek, who had fought everyone in this sector and won every time, had designed their defense systems for enemies who moved in straight lines. Third, the Thervaki general. He was standing near the back of the gallery. I noticed him at minute 3. He had gone very, very still, the way that certain species go still when they are computing something very quickly and very privately. His scarred chromo patch had gone the dark gray of Thervaki concentration. He watched the display for 6 more minutes. Then he sat down, slowly, the way someone sits when their legs have decided something their mind is still working on accepting. Fourth, the Darok attaché. Sorath Vel came into the chamber at minute 7. I do not know why he came to the main chamber. I think perhaps he did not want to be alone wherever he had been. He stood at the back, near the Thervaki general, and he watched the display, and his 17 eyes, one by one, closed. I counted them. I do not know why I counted them. My mind needed something to do with its hands. 17. Minute 9. The Reckoning stopped firing. The sensor display showed the Darok flagship as a debris field. 3 support vessels were gone. The remaining Darok fleet, 11 ships in the outer approach corridor, was moving. Away. Not toward. Not in any formation that could be read as aggressive. Away. Fast. The chamber was silent for a very long time. Then I remembered the mediation request. I checked the communication system. The Reckoning had responded. The response was 2 words. Noted. Resolved. I read those 2 words 4 times. Peth was beside me, and his skin had gone a color I had never seen on a saloon before. not a color in our emotional vocabulary. Something that would need a new word. Something between the pale blue of profound shock and the deep amber of a grief that is still deciding whether it is also relief. I thought about 11 billion people in 3 weeks, and a distress signal I had read every morning for 11 months. I looked at the 2 words on my screen. I saved the document. I did not know what else to do with it. My mediation request, 14 pages and 180 days, and all the language I had spent 34 years learning to use, sat in the sent folder with no response, and would stay there until the subcommittee got around to reviewing it, which would be in approximately 90 days, at which point the matter had already been resolved in 9 minutes by a single ship, and a captain who had apologized for being late. I sat at my desk in the quiet chamber. Outside, very distantly, the Reckoning's drive signature shifted again. It was no longer red. It was going back to the idle register. The ship was still there. It was not leaving. It had simply stopped being whatever it had been for the past 6 hours, and returned to being a vessel sitting in space, unremarkable as anything, if you did not know what it had just done. I thought about the general saying, "They decided before they arrived." I thought about Soreth Vel's 17 eyes closing one by one. I thought about the timer on Peth's tablet, which was still displaying 0000, as if it intended to go on displaying that forever, as if 0 was now simply the time, and there was no clock that would be reset. I had a report to write. I opened a new document and stared at the blank page. The only sentence that came was not a diplomatic sentence. It was not formatted correctly for official communication. It had no subclauses and no cited articles and no hedged professional language to smooth the edges of what it was trying to say. I wrote it anyway, in my private notes, where no committee would read it. 9 minutes. I deleted it. Then I wrote it again. 9 minutes. I left it there and started on the official report. She walked into the convocation hall 3 days later like she had been there before, which she had not. I know this because I had the entry logs pulled. I know this because in the 72 hours between the engagement and her arrival, I had developed a habit of checking the logs, and the sensor feeds, and the Reckoning's positional data, and any document in our archive that touched on humans, in any capacity, including the 42-year-old trade contact file and a 19-page cultural overview that someone had written in 2241, and which had been updated precisely twice since then, both updates in the category of corrections to previously incorrect assumptions. The third update would need to be substantially longer. She came in without an escort. This was unusual. Dignitaries came with aides, security officers, translators, cultural attachés. The minimum professional arrival for a captain-level representative of any military body presenting to the convocation was 7 personnel. She had 2. A younger human male who carried a bag and kept glancing at the ceiling the way beings do when they are trying not to appear overwhelmed by architecture, and a taller human female, with a technical insignia on her collar, who did not look at the ceiling at all, but looked at everything else with a systematic attention that I recognized because I had been taught to do the same thing, and it meant the same thing in every species that did it. She was mapping the exits. Captain Nina Caldwell herself walked ahead of both of them by several paces, not because she was not aware of them, but because she was simply not concerned about the distance. She wore a dark blue dress uniform with precise geometric insignia on the chest, and a scar along her jaw that the uniform made no effort to conceal. Her hands, when she reached the reception area and waited while my aide Peth gathered himself, did not fidget. I had met 843 diplomats and ranking officials in my career. Every single one of them, regardless of species, regardless of composure, had hands that did something when they waited, sorted, tapped, pressed against each other, made small unconscious movements that said, "I am here, and being seen, and I know it." Her hands simply waited with her. I introduced myself. She said she knew who I was, which should not have surprised me but did, and she shook my hand in the human fashion, which I had read about but experiencing is different from reading about. Solid, brief, like a door closing. We walked to the secondary conference room, not the main chamber, because I had made a deliberate choice not to put this conversation on the main chamber floor, with 400 sets of eyes, and as many competing agendas. My small conference room had a long oval table, 7 chairs, a window that looked out onto the station's external hull, and the star field beyond it, and a small unit in the corner that produced approximate beverages for 17 species. I had learned long ago not to offer the human approximation to anyone who had tasted the real thing. Peth arranged chairs. The technical officer, whose name I would later learn was Lieutenant Vera Okafor, stood near the window and looked at the star field with an expression I could not read. The aide, a young man called Daniel Price, sat at the end of the table with a recording unit and the slightly stunned look of someone who was very much aware that they were going to have a very interesting story to tell their family someday. Captain Caldwell sat across from me. She said, "I imagine you have questions." I said, "The convocation has formally requested a comprehensive debrief and incident assessment covering all actions taken by the IHS Reckoning within convocation-adjacent space under Charter Provisions 7 through 14, plus the supplementary protocols attached in 2289. She said, "That is a very long sentence." I said, "It is a very complicated request." She said, "What is the question you actually want to ask?" I looked at her. 34 years of diplomatic training said, "Maintain professional framework. Do not allow the conversation to become personal. Personal conversations create personal stakes, and personal stakes compromise objectivity, and objectivity is the entire job." I said, "How do you decide?" She did not ask me to clarify. She understood what I meant immediately, which told me something, which was that this was not the first time she had been asked this question. She picked up the cup that Peth had placed near her, something warm and dark that was the human approximation, and she held it without drinking. She said, "There is a file in your archives, Human Military Operations, flagged as primitive era context." I said, "Yes." She said, "You read it." I said, 412 documents. "Yes." She said, "Then you know that we have been deciding since before we left our own planet. We have been deciding since before we had ships. We have decided in ways that did not work, and we had to decide again. We have decided with the wrong information, and paid for it, and decided again with better information, and paid for that too. We are not good at not deciding. It is not in our construction." I said, "The Council would argue that the situation required a diplomatic framework." She said, "The Council had a diplomatic framework. 17 months of it." She did not say this with anger. She said it the way you state a number from a report. A count of days. A fact with edges. I said, "The Charter requires consultation before military engagement." She said, "Yes. We will participate in all consultation processes. We will file everything required. I have a staff member who is very good at paperwork and has already begun." She set the cup down. She said, "While we are doing the paperwork, I need the convocation's formal position on the Darak, retaining control of the Ferali worlds they have already settled." The room was very quiet. Lieutenant Okafor, near the window, did not move. Peth's stylus stopped. I said, "That question is currently under review by the relevant subcommittee, which will—" She said, "Ambassador." I stopped. She said, "I am not asking about the subcommittee. I am asking what the convocation's position is. Because if the position is that the Darak retain what they took, then we need to revisit what the word resolved means in the message I sent you, and I would like to have that conversation now, rather than after the paperwork is complete." I sat with that. She was not threatening me. I want to be precise about this because in the months that followed, there were many people who characterized what she said in that room as a threat, and I was there and they were not. She was not threatening. She was informing. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and the entire subsequent mishandling of the Council's response to the humans can be traced back to people who were not in that room, deciding that what she said was a threat, when what she said was, in fact, simply the truth. She said, "What do you want, Captain?" She looked at me with eyes that were a dark, gray-green color that I had not encountered in any species before and have not since. She said, "The same thing you want. I just have a different calculation about what it takes to get there." She stood up. The meeting, apparently, was over. Daniel Price scrambled to collect his recording unit. Lieutenant Okafor turned from the window with the precise, economical movement of someone who had been waiting for that specific signal and had never stopped expecting it. At the door, Caldwell turned. She said, "For the record, Ambassador, your mediation request was well drafted. The framework for the Farali Territorial Review was particularly thoughtful. If the subcommittee wanted to use it as the basis for the resettlement process, it would serve. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome." She left. I sat at the table for 14 minutes after they were gone. Peth did not speak. This was one of the things I valued most about Peth, that he had learned early that there were categories of silence that needed to be left alone, and he could identify them, and he had the discipline not to fill them. Lieutenant Okafor had left a small mark on the window. Not deliberate, just the faint trace of a shoulder that had been resting there, barely visible against the glass. I found myself looking at it. I thought about the Farali distress signal. 3 words. 11 months. I had read it every morning, and filed my formal objections and drafted my frameworks, and sat across the table from Vekrath Dunn, and eaten the words I actually wanted to say, and replaced them with the words the process required. Because that is the job. That is what diplomacy is. You eat the true words and serve the useful ones. 11 billion people. 3 weeks. The reckoning, in 9 minutes. I picked up my stylus and wrote a single line in my private notes. Not an official document, not a filed record. Just the words that were sitting in my chest, demanding to be somewhere other than inside me. She said the same thing you want, and she was right, and I have been sitting across tables from people who burn civilizations, and calling it diplomacy, and I do not know what that means about me, and I do not know what it means about us. I read it back. I did not delete it. I found Varsol, the Thervaki general, in the corridor 2 hours later. He was standing near the hydroponics bay entrance, which was an odd place for a military observer to be standing. And when I approached, he did not look surprised to see me. I said, "You watched the display during the engagement." He said, "Yes." I said, "And the 9 minutes?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What did you see?" He considered this for a long time. Not the way someone considers a question they do not know how to answer, the way someone considers how to answer a question they know the answer to very precisely and want to render it correctly. He said, "I saw a species that calculates patience differently from everyone else. Most species, when they prepare for a conflict, spend the preparation time building uncertainty, hoping the other side will do something that removes the need for action, hoping the situation resolves itself. The humans did not do that. From the moment that ship arrived, there was no uncertainty in it. They had calculated their uncertainty before departure. They had resolved it before they came. What we watched for 6 hours was not a species deciding. It was a species waiting for the clock to confirm the decision they had already made." I said, "And that distinction matters." He said, "It is the only thing that matters, Ambassador. When a species fights without uncertainty, they do not fight like someone who might stop. They fight like someone who has already accounted for stopping and found it unnecessary." He looked at the hydroponics bay door. He said, "I have surrendered twice. Both times, I was fighting an enemy who might have stopped, might have shown a gap. I was looking for the gap. There was no gap here. There was simply the thing happening until it was finished." I said, "Does that frighten you?" He said, "Yes." Then, should it? I did not have an answer for him. I was not sure I would have one for a very long time. Back in my office, with the official report waiting on my screen, I sent a personal message to my counterpart at the Velhari consulate. Counselor Orath Pell was one of the longest-serving members of the convocation floor, a meticulous being who kept detailed records of everything, and who had, for the past 11 months, submitted more formal objections to the Darak expansion than any other delegate. Orath Pell responded within minutes, which told me he had been waiting for contact from someone. He said, "I heard she left quickly." I said, "She made her position clear in less time than it typically takes the subcommittee to agree on a meeting date." He said, "What is her position?" I said, "That we should decide what we actually want, and then say it." Orath Pell was quiet for a moment. He said, "That sounds very simple." I said, "It is. That is the problem with it." He said, "The council is already organizing an emergency session. There will be a resolution, probably within 48 hours. Multiple delegates are using the word unilateral quite urgently." I said, "I know." He said, "And you?" I looked at my screen, at the private note I had not deleted. at the official report that was still waiting for a first line. I said, "I think I need to write a more honest document than I usually do, and I think the council is not going to enjoy reading it." Orath Pell made a sound that his species produces when amused by something unpleasant. He said, "You should rest first. You look terrible, and you have been awake for 2 cycles." I said, "Yes." I did not rest. I went to the hydroponics bay, because the general had been there, and I wanted to understand why, and I stood in front of a plant that was attempting to be a fern without fully committing to the concept, and I looked at the star field through the small porthole in the bay's outer wall, and I tried to find the reckoning in the field of visible objects. I could not. It was not close enough to see without sensors, but I knew it was there. That was the thing. For the first time in 17 months, something was there that I had not put there, and it had not asked for permission, and the Ferali people were alive, and the Darak fleet was retreating, and my 14-page mediation request was in a sent folder, and I did not know what any of that meant about the galaxy I had spent 34 years learning to navigate. But I knew the ship was there. And knowing that was, in a way I could not yet name, and would spend a very long time trying to, not nothing. The emergency session was called for the 48th hour precisely, which told me that someone had been counting. I arrived early, as I always do. The main chamber was filling with a particular kind of energy that I had learned to read over decades, the energy of a collective body that has decided it is frightened and is now organizing around the fear. It looks like urgency. It sounds like concern. It smells, if you have been in enough rooms like it, like the specific combination of anxiety and resolve that produces very long speeches and very short memories. I took my seat at the Soloon Collective Station and set out my materials and watched the delegates arrive. What I noticed was this. Species that had not agreed on anything in living memory were sitting near each other. The Velhari, who occupied a particular historical grievance with the Korath Syndicate, going back 180 years, had placed their secondary delegate in the row adjacent to the Korath primary table, and the two of them were talking, not warmly, not with the body language of beings who had forgotten a century and a half of disagreement, but talking, with the focused efficiency of people who have found, in the past 2 days, a common reference point that is more important than the things that divide them. The common reference point was, of course, the reckoning. Councillor Orath Pell had been right. The word of the session was unilateral. I heard it 47 times, before the formal proceedings even opened. I was counting, because counting gave me something to do with the part of my mind that was otherwise going to spend the morning sitting with thoughts that would not help me do my job. Secretary Prime Gore Valen called the session to order. She did not editorialize. She did not express an opinion about recent events. She opened the floor and named the question before the body. The convocation must determine its formal position on the actions of the Human Interstellar Authority vessel, IHS Reckoning, within the convocation-adjacent sector, including the engagement resulting in the destruction of Darak sovereignty naval vessels without prior council authorization. Simple. Clean. Legal language. The destruction of Darak sovereignty naval vessels. I thought about how long it had taken to say that in simple words, and I thought about how long the Darak had taken to destroy 11 billion people, and I kept those two things next to each other in my mind for the entire session, and did not write them in the official record. The first to speak was the Korath primary delegate, a female named Velran Sorath, elegant and precise, a species that produced lawyers and philosophers in the same proportion that some species produced soldiers. She laid out the case against the human action in 11 minutes. It was a good case. It cited the relevant charter articles cleanly. It traced the precedent implications with real precision, and it built to its conclusion with the kind of architectural tidiness that I found, even at my most professionally skeptical, genuinely impressive. The argument was this. The convocation exists because every species agreed to it. The agreement has one central principle. That principle is that no species takes military action affecting another species in convocation space without authorization from the council body. Not because military action is always wrong, but because if every species reserves the right to act unilaterally when they individually judge the situation to require it, then there is no agreement. There is only power. If the humans can do this to the Darak for one atrocity, then any species can do this to any species for any reason they choose to call an atrocity. The door does not stay open for only the people who are right. It was a good argument. I had made versions of it myself, in other sessions, about other situations. She sat down. Then things became less orderly. The next 6 speakers were, broadly, in agreement with Velran Sorath. The language varied. The emotional register varied, from cold legal analysis to something hotter and more personal, particularly from the delegate of the Wrath Collective, a species that had spent 3 generations trying to get the Convocation to formally address what the Darak had done to their outer colonies 50 years ago, and being told that the process was ongoing. The delegate's name was Tor Velan. He was young by Wrath reckoning, which still made him older than I was, and he had a stillness about him that I recognized as the stillness of someone who has been patient for so long that patience has become something else, something harder and quieter than its original form. He did not agree with Velran Sorath. He said, "I have sat in this chamber for 40 years. I have watched this body produce more than 300 formal statements of concern. I have watched it authorize 12 investigation committees. I have watched it debate the precise legal language of 6 separate resolutions regarding the Darak sovereignty's conduct in the outer systems. I have watched it vote on all 6. I have watched all 6 fail to produce any outcome that the Darak were required to acknowledge." He paused. He said, "The Ferali cluster has been free for 48 hours. In 48 hours, the humans accomplished what this body could not in 11 months of process. I will not stand in this chamber and call that a problem." The room erupted. Not dramatically. The Convocation does not permit drama, technically, but in the particular way that 400 species express disagreement simultaneously, the room became very loud and very complicated for approximately 2 minutes, while the Secretary Prime allowed the noise to run its course before calling for order. I looked at the sensor display in the corner of the chamber, the live feed that Peth had arranged to remain active on a small subsidiary screen throughout the session. The reckoning was still in position, not moving, not signaling, simply there, in the way it had been there for 2 days, steady as a geographic feature. The session continued. By the 3rd hour, a pattern had emerged that I had not anticipated when I arrived. The delegates who argued for formal sanction against the humans were, broadly, the delegates from species with long diplomatic traditions, with deep institutional investment in the Convocation framework, with historical experiences that had taught them that the agreed process, however slow, was the only thing standing between the galaxy and a return to the era when power was the only argument that anyone took seriously. I understood them. I agreed with significant parts of what they said. I had spent 34 years believing what they believed. The delegates who argued against sanction were, broadly, the delegates from species who had been on the wrong end of a situation the Convocation process had failed to resolve. The Wrath Collective, the Ferali survivor representatives, 2 of them, who had arrived at the station 2 days ago and sat at their table with expressions that I did not have language for. The Velhari, who had submitted 47 formal objections and watched the Ferali cluster disappear while those objections were under review. And, increasingly, the Thurvaki. Var Sol was in the gallery, not on the floor, but I could see him from my seat. He was listening with the total attention of someone who has spent a lifetime developing the ability to hear what is actually being said beneath what is being said. When the Korath delegate made a point about precedent, he tilted his head very slightly. When the Wrath delegate spoke, he was completely still. I was called to present at hour 4. This was my role. The Soluan Collective held a senior mediation position, which meant that in contested sessions, I was often asked to present the neutral synthesis, the professional accounting of all positions that helped the body find a path forward. I had done this for 30 years. I stood up. I had prepared 3 different versions of my remarks. The formal diplomatic synthesis, which walked through all positions and concluded by recommending a moderate censure with a commission of inquiry. The cautious version, which delayed the censure pending further review. The version I had almost not brought at all, which was the version that said what I actually believed. I stood at the podium. I looked at the Ferali representatives. They were watching me. Both of them, a female named Sara Velen, and a male whose name I had been given as Korath, but not the Korath, meaning it was a name in his own language, and it had been transliterated badly, and I felt the small, specific sorrow of that, the bad transliteration, the bureaucratic failure of small consideration, the way that 400 species sharing a common space could still, in the smallest moments, fail to see each other. I set down 2 of the 3 versions of my remarks. I kept the third. I said, I will tell you what I observed, and then I will tell you what I believe, and I ask the body's patience with the second part, because it will be less comfortable than the first. The chamber went quiet. I said, I observed a species arrive with a single vessel, and make a single demand, and wait the time they had specified, and then take an action that accomplished in 9 minutes what this body could not accomplish in 11 months. I observed the Darok fleet retreat from a sector they had considered secure. I observed the Ferali cluster become free 48 hours ago. Those are the observations. I paused. I said, what I believe is this. The Convocation's concern about unilateral military action is legitimate. The Charter principle is sound. If every species acts on its own judgment without consultation, we do not have a system. We have chaos with a meeting room. I paused again. Then, but I also believe that a system which cannot act is not a system. It is a procedure, and a procedure that produces correct language around incorrect outcomes is not justice. It is very expensive paperwork. Several delegates shifted. I said, I am not recommending we abandon the Charter. I am not recommending we endorse the human action as a model to be followed without oversight. I am recommending that before we vote to formally sanction the only actors in this situation who produced an outcome that the Ferali people did not have to survive, we ask ourselves honestly what we are protecting. If we are protecting the system because the system works, that is one answer. If we are protecting the system because we are afraid of what it means that the system did not work this time, that is a different answer. And only one of those 2 answers is honest. I sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Orath Pel stood and said, I second the recommendation for honest accounting. Then the Wrath delegate stood. Then 3 more. Then 7. Not endorsing my specific words, but standing, which in convocation procedure means, I am with this portion of the discussion. I am not passing it by. The Korath delegate, Velran Sorath, watched all of this from her seat. She was a highly intelligent being and she understood what was happening. She did not look angry. She looked, if I am reading Korath expressions correctly, which I have only moderate confidence in, like someone watching a calculation produce a result they had not expected. The vote took another 2 hours to reach. Formal sanction against the Human Interstellar Authority failed. Narrow, barely, but failed. There was no celebration. This was not a victory for anything. It was a body that could not reach consensus on what to do about a thing that had happened. And could not reach consensus is not the same as a decision, and everyone in the chamber understood that. I understood it too. What happened next is the part I will carry for the rest of my career. Sorath Vel was present for the vote. He had come as an observer, the surviving senior Darok diplomatic representative on the station, with the specific permission of the Secretary Prime, who had cited a policy of maintaining open-channel communication with all parties regardless of status. I had expected him to be angry. I had expected the Darok's particular version of cold, contemptuous anger, which I had experienced many times and had learned to let pass through me without leaving marks. He was not angry. After the session closed and the delegations began to file out, he crossed the chamber floor to me. He moved like someone who has made peace with carrying something heavy. He was the only Darok left on the station. His fleet was gone. His flagship was a debris field in an outer approach corridor, and he was here, alone, in the chamber where the council had just declined to formally punish the people who had done that. He stopped in front of me. He said, in perfect Soloon, which I had not known he spoke until that moment, which told me something about who Sorath Vel actually was. Your humans are fortunate that the Darok do not carry longer memories, or better targeting data. I processed that. He turned and left. Peth was at my shoulder. He said, is that a threat? I looked at the door Sorath Vel had just walked through. I thought about the tone of his voice, the specific flatness of it, the way he had held himself while he said it. I thought about my father, who had been a strategy stones player of the kind that does not lose, and the one time I had beaten him, and what he had said afterward. Not angry, not humiliated, something quieter than either. I said, no. Peth said. Then what was it? I said, I think it was the closest a Darok diplomat will ever come to saying that they understand they overestimated themselves, and that they have decided to recalibrate. Peth was quiet for a moment. He said, Is that good? I said, It is real. That is not the same as good. But it is more than we have had in 17 months of formal objection letters. I needed to leave the chamber after that. The hydroponics bay was my destination again, which had apparently become the place I went when I needed to think thoughts that had nowhere else to exist. The not quite fern was where I had left it, doing its imperfect best, and I stood in front of it, and looked at it, and thought about the vote, and Sorath Vel's perfect saloon, and 9 minutes, and what the galaxy looked like now that the thing none of us had been certain was real, had turned out to be real. The reckoning was still out there. It had not been invited. It had not been authorized. It had arrived because the humans had received a distress signal and decided that a distress signal was a sufficient instruction, and that 11 months of subcommittee review was not. The system had failed to act. The humans had acted. The Ferali people were free. And now the council had failed to formally sanction the humans, which meant the humans had acted, and the council had looked at that action and could not agree on whether it was wrong, and that was not the same as saying it was right, but it was not nothing either. I thought about what Captain Caldwell had said. The same thing you want. I thought about the mountain that was not on the map. I thought about maps. I was an ambassador. My job was to know the map and use it, and help other beings use it, and keep the peace that existed in the spaces between the territories that were marked. I had believed that the map was the most important thing, that the lines on it, the agreements and the charters and the processes and the procedures, were what kept the galaxy from becoming the thing it had been before anyone sat down at a table together. I still believed that. But I was beginning to understand that a map with missing mountains is a liability, not just an inconvenience. And the humans were a mountain. They had always been a mountain. We had just been filing them under the wrong category. The official report took me 4 days to write. 4 days, which is twice as long as any report I have produced in my career, including the one I wrote after the Yelvani currency collapse when I had 1,100 pages of testimony to synthesize, and a Secretary Prime breathing down my neck every 6 hours. That report had been long. This report was not long. This report was 14 pages. It was the shortest document of significance I had produced since my first year of service. The length was not the problem. The problem was every sentence. I would write a sentence, the kind of sentence I knew how to write, clean and neutral and professionally weighted, and I would read it back, and the sentence would be accurate, and it would also be a small, precise lie. Not a dishonest lie, a lie of category. A lie that comes from choosing the language that preserves the framework over the language that describes what happened. I deleted my first draft in its entirety at hour 31. I started again. My second draft was better. It described the reckoning's arrival, the 6-hour window, the engagement, the outcome, and the council session that followed. It presented the split opinion within the convocation fairly. It was the kind of document that a subcommittee could read and file and reference in future proceedings without discomfort. I deleted it at hour 54. The problem, which I kept arriving at, and departing from, and arriving at again, was Captain Caldwell's question. Not any question she had asked me. The one she had not asked but which her presence constituted. The one that her 9 minutes of engagement and 2-word response and careful conversation in my small conference room had been, in sum, constructing. What do you want the galaxy to look like? Not what does the charter require. Not what does the process recommend. Not what does the established framework suggest as the appropriate next step. What do you want? I had built my career on the premise that what I wanted was irrelevant. That diplomacy was the practice of removing personal want from the equation. That the ambassador's role was to want the agreement, the maintained table, the signed document, and nothing beyond that. Because wanting specific outcomes was bias, and bias was the thing that broke negotiations, and broken negotiations were the thing that sent species back to burning each other's worlds. I believed this. I still believe parts of it. But I had also spent 11 months reading a distress signal every morning, and writing careful professional language about it, and sending the language to committees that sent it to other committees, and the signal had stayed active for all 11 months, and 11 billion people had been waiting inside those months, and I had done the right thing, in the right way, and it had made no difference at all, until a single ship arrived and decided to make a different kind of difference. I wrote my third draft. This one said something true. It said, "The convocation process failed to produce an outcome in the Ferali situation. This is not a failure of the process in principle. It is a failure of the process in practice. The distinction matters because a process can fail in practice while remaining valid in principle, and the appropriate response is to examine the practical failure rather than abandon the principle. The Council should conduct a formal review of why 11 months of process produced no outcome, not in order to assign blame, but in order to understand the specific structural gap that allowed a situation to persist until external action was required." That part I was satisfied with. The harder part came next. I wrote, "The human interstellar authority's action without Council authorization is a legitimate concern. The charter principle that unilateral military action undermines collective security is sound, and the Council's inability to formally sanction that action suggests that the body itself is uncertain about how to weigh that principle against the outcome it produced. This uncertainty is honest. It should be named honestly, rather than papered over by a motion that does not reflect the actual division of opinion." I read that section 3 times. It was not comfortable. It was true. I kept it. The final section was the one I rewrote most. It was the one about what came next. The recommendations. In every report I had ever written, the recommendations section was the part I was most confident in, because recommendations are where the diplomatic expertise lives, where 34 years of pattern recognition and institutional knowledge produce actionable guidance that the body can use. This time, the recommendations section was 2 paragraphs. The first recommended the Ferali resettlement framework I had drafted in my original mediation request, with modifications based on the current situation. The second said, "The convocation should establish a formal dialogue channel with the Human Interstellar Authority, at the level of permanent liaison, not case-by-case consultation. This is not a reward for unilateral action. It is an acknowledgement that the Human Interstellar Authority exists, that it acts, that its actions affect convocation-adjacent space, and that a relationship defined by absence is less stable than a relationship defined by structure. We can disagree with their methods within a formal relationship. We cannot influence their methods without one." I sent the report to Secretary Prime Gore Valen at hour 97. She read it the same day, which told me she had been waiting for it. She called me 4 hours later and said, "This will not be a comfortable document for several delegations." I said, "No." She said, "It is an honest document." I said, "I tried." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The formal liaison recommendation will require a full council vote. I expect it will pass. Narrowly." I said, "I expect you are right." She said, "I also expect you know who they will want as the convocation's permanent liaison to the Human Interstellar Authority." I had known since I started the third draft. I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you willing?" I thought about Sorath Vel's perfect Soloon, about Var Sol's scarred chromo patch, and his careful accounting of what it looked like when a species had already decided, about the not-quite fern and the distress signal and 9 minutes and the 2 words on my screen that I still had open in a private window because I had not yet been able to close them. I said, "Yes." The days between the report submission and the Council's liaison vote were the strangest I had experienced on the station. Not dramatic, the opposite of dramatic. The ordinary business of 400 species continued in its ordinary way. Committees met. Documents were filed. The cafeteria served its approximations. The Thervaki still burned whatever they burned, and it still smelled like nothing else anywhere. But underneath all of it, something had shifted. The specific quality of how beings talked to each other had changed in a way I could feel, but would have struggled to describe in diplomatic language. There was a new awareness in the room. Not fear, or not only fear. Something more like the awareness that comes after you realize a thing you had filed confidently under a certain category does not actually belong there, and now you have to reclassify it, and the reclassification changes other things you thought you had understood. The humans were being reclassified, not just by me, by everyone. Lieutenant Okafor, Caldwell's technical officer, had apparently remained on the station while the captain returned briefly to the reckoning, She spent most of her days in the station's public library, reading. I asked Peth what she was reading, because I was curious, and because I had learned that what a species reaches for when they have time to themselves says more about them than almost anything else. He found out through the library access records, which was perhaps slightly outside proper channels, but I did not ask him to account for his methods. She was reading Soloon diplomatic history. 40 years of it. She was reading it in the original language, using a translation matrix, making annotations. I sat with that information for a while. Then I sent her a message through official channels, asking if she would like the annotations explained in person, over the approximation of tea. She accepted within the hour. We sat in my small conference room for 2 hours, Lieutenant Okafor and she asked questions about Soloon diplomatic practice with the specific, targeted intelligence of someone who is not exploring out of politeness. She wanted to understand how the Soloon had built the first cross-species mediation frameworks. She wanted to understand how the trust had been established in the early years, when there was no precedent and no guarantee. She wanted to understand what it had cost. I answered honestly. At one point she said, "We are not good at this part." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The patience, the sitting across from someone who is wrong about something important, and finding the language that moves them toward being less wrong, without making them feel like they have lost something." I said, "It is a skill that can be learned." She said, "Yes, I think the captain knows that. I think that is why she wanted to come here herself." I said, "Rather than send someone else." She said, "Rather than send someone who already knew how." I thought about that for the rest of the day. The council liaison vote passed at day 6 of the post-engagement period. The margin was not comfortable, 43% opposed, but it passed. I was formally appointed as the Convocation's permanent liaison to the Human Interstellar Authority. Peth, who had been with me for 3 years, and who I was going to have to find a replacement for because I would need someone with different skills in the new role, tried very hard to look professional about the news, and mostly succeeded. I began preparing for the formal introduction. It was in that preparation that I first started to understand something about the humans, that the 412 archived files had not fully conveyed. They had known this was coming. Not this specifically. Not the Ferali cluster or Vekrath Dun, or the specific 9 minutes of the specific engagement. But the shape of it, they had known, in the way that a species knows things that their history has taught them, at a cost that leaves marks, that a moment would arrive when the galaxy saw what they were. They had prepared for it. Not in the way that a species prepares for war. In the way that a species prepares for the conversation that happens after. The formal introduction was scheduled for day 8. Captain Caldwell had returned from the reckoning. The meeting would be in the main chamber, not the small conference room, because this was now official. The night before, I was in the hydroponics bay again. The fern was doing better, or perhaps I had simply recalibrated my expectations for ferns. Caldwell found me there. She was in a less formal uniform than the first time. She looked like someone who had slept recently, which was a specific kind of look I had not seen on her before, and it made her seem briefly like a different person, less the captain of a warship and more simply a human who was tired and had slept and was now somewhat less tired. She sat on the planter without ceremony. She looked at the fern. She said, "My grandmother had one of these. Real ones. Back on Earth. She used to say they were the most stubborn plant in existence, that they had survived every extinction event in the planet's history by simply being too inconvenient to die." I said, "I find that comforting." She said, "Me too." We were quiet for a moment. I said, "I have been assigned as permanent convocation liaison to your authority." She said, "I know. Congratulations." I said, "I am not certain that is the appropriate response." She said, "It is the human one. We congratulate people when they are given difficult jobs. It acknowledges the difficulty." I said, "It is a difficult job." She said, "Yes." Then, "You wrote an honest report." I said, "You read it." She said, "We were given a copy through formal channels." I said, "And?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fern with the specific expression that I was beginning to understand meant she was choosing words carefully, not because she was uncertain of them, but because she wanted them to land correctly. She said, "It said what needed to be said. in a way that didn't make anyone the villain. That is harder than it looks. Most people can't do it when one side did what they think was right, and the other side did what they think was right, and the outcomes are different. I said, I did not think the purpose of the report was to assign villainy. She said, no. But you had the option to, and you didn't. That matters. I said, Captain, can I ask you something personally? She said, Nina. I said, Nina, how do you live with it? The 9 minutes. The decision. How does that sit in you? She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought perhaps I had misread the moment. That the question was too direct. That there were human customs around this I had not read in any of the 42-year-old trade files. Then she said, the same way you lived with the 11 months. You just have to decide which weight you would rather carry, I said. And if you chose wrong, she said, then you know that too. And you carry that, and you make better calculations next time, and you do not pretend that the cost was less than it was. Because pretending costs more in the end. She stood up. She said, there is a situation developing in the outer corridors. We have been tracking it for 3 weeks. Keth Dominion movement near the colony systems. Nothing confirmed yet. But the shape of it looks like things we have seen before, I said. I have had a preliminary report on the Keth situation in my queue for 4 days. She said, your preliminary report and ours probably look different. We should compare them. I said, yes. She said, that is what a formal liaison relationship looks like, in practice. She left. I stood in the hydroponics bay and looked at the fern for a while longer. Then I went to my office. My aide, Peth, was still there, which told me he had been waiting. He was too professional to say so I did not acknowledge it. I simply sat down and opened a new communication channel. For a moment, I sat with the blank screen. 34 years of language. 17 ceasefires. 4 full peace settlements. The right words in the right order, for every situation I had encountered, and most of the situations I had anticipated encountering, and some I had not anticipated at all. I opened the channel to the Human Interstellar Authority. I said, this is Ambassador Vreth Ka of the Soloon Collective, speaking in my capacity as Permanent Convocation Liaison. We have a situation developing in the outer corridors that we would like to discuss at the earliest opportunity. I paused. Then I said, and we want to make sure you know. The response came in 4 minutes. Not 4 hours. Not 4 days. Not 11 months. 4 minutes. Captain Caldwell's voice, clear and direct, saying, we know. We have had eyes on it for 3 weeks. We had hoped the convocation would reach out. Glad you did. I said, thank you. She said, Ambassador, this is how it should work. I said, yes. I closed the channel. Peth was looking at me. His skin had gone the warm copper color of something that does not quite have a name in Soloon, something between relief and the moment before a long journey when you have finally confirmed that you are packed correctly. I said, file a formal notification to all convocation delegates that the liaison channel is open and operational. He said, yes, Ambassador. I said, and find me the most current intelligence we have on Keth Dominion expansion methodology. Full archive, nothing filtered for comfort. He said, right away. He moved to do it. I looked at my screen, at the closed channel, at the blinking indicator that showed the line to the Human Interstellar Authority was live and logged and on record. I thought about the Keth Dominion and what I knew about them, a species that had spent 40 years carefully testing the edges of everything, probing at boundaries, taking small steps and waiting to see what response each step produced, learning the tolerances of the systems around them, learning what could be pushed and what would push back. They had spent 40 years learning those tolerances. In the past 8 days, the tolerances had changed. There was a new piece of information in the galaxy's understanding of itself. The Keth Dominion had not yet fully integrated it. I did not know what they would do when they did. But I knew that 4 minutes was now part of the conversation. And I knew, in the particular way that a diplomat knows the things that will matter in the years ahead, that 4 minutes was going to be the most important number in the outer corridors for a very long time. The Keth Dominion went quiet 2 weeks later. Their expansion movement in the outer colony sectors reversed course. 3 colony worlds that had been receiving daily Keth signals abruptly stopped receiving them. I wrote it in the record without comment. Sometimes the most important diplomatic outcome is the absence of a thing. The 11 billion people of the Farali cluster began the long work of coming home. I filed that in the record too. I filed it first.